it is a reflection, I believe, of the pressure the president is feeling from the American people.
Let's move on to Iran, Israel, because David Lammy is in Geneva today, having been in Washington, D.C., so he won't be voting. Today, he's talking for talks with the European countries and the Iranian foreign minister. Donald Trump has given Iran a 2-week reprieve. Let's talk to Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, a former US diplomat and the President Emerita of the Middle East Council. Welcome to the show, Gina.
Thank you and good morning.
What do you think is going to happen in the 2 weeks? Neil Ferguson, the historian, was at the Times CEO Summit yesterday, and he said bombing would start last night. He'd been assured, and suddenly Donald Trump gives Iran a 2-week reprieve. Is this a sign he's determined, if he can, to stay out of things?
Well, I believe it's important that we keep in mind it's up to 2 weeks. So the bombing could have started last night or tonight or tomorrow. It would be a mistake to think that there's up 2 weeks out there. That said, it is a reflection, I believe, of the pressure the president is feeling from the American people. Polls have shown that the American people are not in favor of going to war with Iran at this time. Americans have questions about our decision to do so, that it was under our control. This was a war that was started by Israel, not the United States. But there's an old saying, don't have your mouth write checks that your body can't pay. And of course, with the Israelis wanting to fully take out the Iranian nuclear enrichment abilities, it does require the United States. So there are Americans who are saying we should not. And of course, we have a lot of Iran hawks in the government, some around the country who believe that Iran has been a threat. And so the president is hearing from everyone. He has a long record of being mercurial, of changing his mind from one day to another. So I think anyone who is speculating that what decision he's going to make in the end will be doing nothing more than guessing, because only Donald Trump knows. And I do believe he is thinking legacy. He doesn't have to be reelected again. He does believe that he can bring people along regardless of his decision. He may be able to, but this is a big one. And the end game, what happens if we do, even what is in the Israelis' heads about the day after. We've seen disaster in Gaza for nearly 2 years. There's no day after plan from the Israeli perspective. And the American people are not that interested in getting caught up in what the Israelis have done in Gaza to the extent that we would be active participants in doing it to Iran.
I mean, he did take out the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards under his first presidency. There's an argument for saying a surgical strike on Iran's nuclear facilities and stopping there is doable without risking further escalation.
That's an argument. The word surgical, when you're dropping 30,000-ton bombs, may be a slight misnomer, but hopefully we won't see, or hopefully you're right if we do see. But you have to keep in mind that the government is under horrific pressure in Iran. It wasn't popular anyway from the first place. But these Israeli attacks can do two things. One, as the Israelis are hoping, cause people to rise up and remove the government, or as we have seen over the 2 years with Hamas, for a significant period of time, people were focused on who was causing this damage. And with the increasing numbers of casualties, including civilians in Iran, it may bring people to the side of the government because the Israelis are dropping bombs and destroying infrastructure and civilian targets. But then the question after, who comes after if the government does indeed fall? And we have seen the results of efforts at regime change, Iraq, Afghanistan. There's nothing positive that makes anybody want to rush into that, certainly not the United States. And it's what would the Israelis do? So we could have something far worse. And that makes diplomatic efforts, not only those going on with the vice president and special envoy Witkoff, but the rest of the world, European efforts from those in the region, because we know that Arabs in the Gulf, Iran's neighbors, are very concerned about escalation and what might happen, and whether the Iranians are going to react to being pushed against the wall in a rational fashion as we see it. And as a negotiator, you never want to put your opponent in a corner where they have the option to act irrationally.
Absolutely, and it's finding an off-ramp for the Iranians is possibly one of the most important issues. Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, a former US diplomat and President Emerita of the Middle East Council, thank you for coming on the show.
Nikki, do you think there is a danger here that decisions are being rushed through? And of course, we've got this 2-week respite from President Trump where he says, he's hoping that there will be negotiations taking place. But do you have that concern that things are moving quite quickly?
Well, certainly a concern that things are moving quite quickly. It's been a pretty sobering week, hasn't it? And I think probably like many others, you turn the radio on every morning, you think, what am I going to find out has happened overnight? And of course, President Trump has said, within the next 2 weeks. It's not a definite 2 weeks, but we have to hope that David Lammy's conversations with the Iranian foreign minister alongside France and Germany today are constructive and do perhaps bear some fruit. I think that the fact is that events will sort of unfold at their own pace, if you like, and so I think that the UK way to have this time, you've identified the issues about Diego Garcia, but there'll be many other complicated legal and logistical issues about as you know, we've got planes that are being flown out closer to potential action, but there'll be many other things about where various personnel are, various analysis. So to have that little bit of time, but frankly, you have to go at the events at the pace that events are unfolding. And so you can't say to the Iranians or to the Israelis or anyone else, look, hang on a second, can we just have a bit more time? Our lawyers need a bit more time. Our parliament needs a bit more time and everything else. It doesn't work like that. Everyone has to move really quickly. And that is what government does. It's what the armed forces do extremely well. I think probably it's us, the public, who are trying to catch up. You're asking all the right questions of people on the show. But I think it was interesting. Lisa Nandy, I thought was honest this morning in the sense, they don't have all the answers, and nor in a way should they, because these are complicated issues that they are trying to work their way through. And she's also right, you don't want to put armed forces personnel in jeopardy. There's a limited amount to what can be said publicly, but there'll be an awful lot of action going on behind the scenes.
Jack, do you worry that things are being rushed, or as Nikki says, do you just have to go with the pace of what's happening before you?
Well, I think it's an indication that we would have said yesterday morning probably everything's being rushed, and yet this morning, surprisingly, there seems to be a period for some consideration and some dialogue, which can only be helpful, I think. I'm always a little bit concerned that people outside the region dictate the terms of what is going on, but I do think it's probably a good idea for the Europeans to be back involved. I think they can be reasonably independent in those discussions and trusted on different sides. But I think the feelings and the impacts inside the region are also really, really important. There have been big changes in countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE over recent years, the changes in their relationships with Israel even. And while I think a lot of the activity by Hamas and by Hezbollah, until they were effectively neutered, a lot of that activity in the past 2 years has been about disrupting those diplomatic relationships. So I think, yes, consideration at our end on the impact on us, yes to being involved in the European discussions that might help provide a diplomatic solution rather than a military solution, but also I think critically involving the big voices in the region, because this is still a region where there's a civil war in Yemen, a new government in Syria that nobody's too sure yet whether they can trust and what the implications of that might be. Obviously, the horrific situation in Israel, Gaza, and so on, and many more problems too, in Lebanon and elsewhere. So good that we're involved in the discussions. Good that there's a bit of a period of time for people to consider the implications of what they might do. But I think also critically important that we help promote stability in the region and a regional solution that might be more sustainable than one imposed from a different continent.
Nikki, there's been lots of discussion, hasn't there, in recent days of, echoes of the build-up to the Iraq war. And I think a lot of people just assume knowledge about what that means, because there's clearly many differences as well. From your point of view, what do you think? I'm going to ask Jack as well, because obviously, he had quite an important role in that time. But for you, Nikki, do you think it has echoes of that?
I think it probably does. I'd be interested to hear Jack's perspective, because he was there. I was a parliamentary candidate at the time, so having stood in one election and waiting to hopefully be selected for the next one. And so I remember obviously the debates. I mean, I think in Parliament and people's very personal, often long-held views about whether they supported military action or not. I mean, I think it is, well, so one of the things we're waiting to hear is exactly how Keir Starmer and the government would involve Parliament in debating this. That was one of the lessons, I think, from Iraq. Yes, there were votes, but I think parliamentarians didn't feel sufficiently involved in the debates around what was happening. I think perhaps because it's partly the same part of the world, people are drawing parallels with that. But I think it is a different situation. But I was fascinated by the interview you did earlier on with somebody from the Iranian diaspora living here in the UK, about how closely they obviously are watching the situation, particularly in regards for many of them wanting to see regime change. And so I suppose that has parallels. But I think there are differences, but undoubtedly it's going to stir up a lot of the same things, which is, do parliamentarians have sufficient voice in this to exercise influence on the government?
Jack, you were First Minister, of course, during the Iraq War. What do you remember of the build-up to that time? And do you see any similarities now, what the differences are?
Well, what a period of time. George Bush launched the invasion on the day that I was launching my election campaign for the 2003 Scottish Parliament election. It was a hell of a time, and it impacted at every level. I took the view at the time that it would have been preferable for the US and the UK to get UN approval for what they were about to do. But I also took the view, as soon as it became clear that military action was going to happen or was happening, that in that situation with British troops and British firepower involved, that you had to choose a side, and that I certainly wasn't going to choose the side of Saddam, who had so cruelly and horribly assassinated and killed so many of his own people over the years. So it was a very difficult political judgment to make when asked, as I was at the time, by the Prime Minister for my opinion. But I don't think this is necessarily the same situation. I think in Iraq it was very targeted. There was a lot of history, and I think a lot of what happened in Iraq went back to the previous period at the beginning of the 1990s, and that feeling that George Bush Sr. had not, quote unquote, finished the job. I think this is a slightly different situation, and we've got a very different American president, we've actually got a very different British Prime Minister as well. So these are very different personalities. And both of them, although Trump was in office before, both of them have been in office for a relatively short period of time. And in that situation, I think treading carefully, would be very, very wise.